It's 1968, and Las Vegas is a playground built for grown-ups. Mobsters in tailored suits, cigarette smoke, cocktail waitresses, high stakes behind velvet ropes. Then, in the middle of all that, a giant pink and white circus tent lands on the strip. No slot machine lullabies, just trapeze artists swinging over the blackjack tables. Over the next 5 decades, that $15 million fever dream grows into a billion-dollar empire, gets swallowed whole by a corporate giant, and ends up changing hands for a price that would barely buy a decent chunk of Malibu, all while sitting on land some now argue is worth more than the resort built on top of it ever was. So today, we're digging into the rise and fall of Circus Circus, a $1.5 billion Vegas decline. A casino with no hotel. Jay Sarno was already a legend by the time he thought up Circus Circus. 2 years earlier, in August 1966, he'd opened Caesar's Palace, the place that basically invented the idea that a casino could be a fantasy world instead of just a room full of card tables. Before Caesar's, Sarno had spent years building and losing money on a chain of cabana motels across Texas, Georgia, and California, learning the hard way what worked and what didn't. He grew up with a genuine fascination with carnivals and showmanship, and apparently never really got that out of his system, because his next move, less than 2 years after unveiling ancient Rome on the Strip, was to build an entire casino shaped like a circus, aimed squarely at adults who'd grown tired of the same old pit games. Sarno wasn't shy about what he was trying to do, either. He wanted Circus Circus to be a spectacle first and a casino second, something no other operator on the Strip was even attempting at the time. Most of his competitors thought the idea was borderline insane. Why would anyone want acrobats distracting gamblers from their cards? Sarno's answer was simple. If nobody else was doing it, there'd be no competition. On October 18, 1968, Circus Circus opened its doors at 10 p.m., with Sarno himself dressed as ringmaster in a top hat and tails, greeting officials, movie stars, and reporters who'd flown in from around the country to see what he'd built. More than 10,000 people showed up that first night. The line to get in stretched for over a block, 4 people wide. Las Vegas historian David Schwartz, who literally wrote the book on Sarno's life and career, later noted that with a line like that, Sarno's triumph must have seemed all but guaranteed. It cost around $15 million to build, which sounds almost quaint by today's Las Vegas standards, where a single fountain show can cost more than that. Inside, gamblers found 686 slot machines, 19 blackjack tables, 2 roulette wheels, 8 craps tables, and 14 separate bars and restaurants. And, hanging above all of it, real trapeze artists and high-wire acts performing directly over the gaming floor. 1,000 employees worked the floor in colorful, circus-themed costumes. There was an elephant. There was an all-you-can-eat dessert station, literally called the Diet Buster, which is either the most honest or the most sarcastic name ever given to a Las Vegas buffet, depending on how you look at it. Here's the problem, though. Sarno built a casino and completely forgot to build a hotel. He genuinely believed the spectacle alone would be enough to pull people in from other properties, so why bother giving them a place to sleep? He also charged admission at the door, $2 for tourists, $1 for locals, which is possibly one of the worst ideas in the history of a city built on making people feel like winners the second they walk in. Combine that with acrobats swinging over the craps tables, distracting the high rollers, and you've got a formula that, shockingly, did not print money. By 1969, less than a year after that triumphant opening night, Circus Circus was already teetering on the edge of collapse. The circus theme people loved. The execution nearly killed the whole operation before it had a chance to grow up. The rough years. To keep the place alive, Sarno and his partner Stanley Mallon secured a loan from the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund to finally build a hotel tower, which opened its first rooms in 1972, 4 years after the casino itself had already opened. That loan came with strings attached, because in early Las Vegas, almost everything did. Part of the deal reportedly handed the gift shop concession to a man named Anthony Spilotro, the Chicago mob's enforcer in Vegas, better known by his nickname, the Ant. Spilotro would go on to become one of the most notorious organized crime figures in Nevada history, and later inspired a character in a well-known Martin Scorsese film about the exact kind of city Circus Circus was trying, somewhat awkwardly, to family-friendly its way out of. Sarno was also dealing with his own legal headaches around this time, including a federal indictment over an alleged $75,000 bribe offered to an IRS agent. He was eventually acquitted at trial in 1975, represented by a young Las Vegas defense attorney named Oscar Goodman, who would later become the city's mayor. But the stress of running a struggling casino, fending off federal prosecutors, and watching his creative vision get bogged down by financial reality clearly wore on Sarno. By 1974, tired, cash-strapped, and looking to get out, he and his partners leased Circus Circus to two men who would completely rewrite its future, William Bennett and William Pennington. Bennett and Pennington take over. Bennett wasn't a showman like Sarno. He was a numbers guy, a former World War II pilot who'd worked his way up managing casinos, most notably turning the downtown Mint from a $2 million annual loss into a $9 million profit before teaming up with Reno businessman Bill Pennington. The two of them leased Circus Circus in 1974 with an option to buy, and it's fair to say they saw something in the property that Sarno, for all his creativity, had never quite figured out how to use. As one Las Vegas gaming historian later put it, Sarno had built Circus Circus for an adult market and then charged that same market an entrance fee to get in, a combination that was never going to end well. Bennett went to work fixing exactly that. He put a ceiling over the casino floor. He pushed the circus acts up onto a midway, out of the way of the tables, so gamblers could actually concentrate. He dropped the admission fee entirely, and instead of chasing high rollers the way every other casino on the Strip was doing, he leaned all the way into the opposite direction and went after Middle America. $20 rooms, cheap buffets, a family atmosphere that didn't require anyone to feel underdressed or out of place walking through the door. His daughter, Diana Bennett, later said her father approached the business the same way he approached anything else he ran: figure out what people actually want, then offer it at the best possible price. It wasn't glamorous, it was never supposed to be, but it worked, and it worked fast. Circus Circus became the model for what people started calling the low-roller casino. In 1979, the property added an RV park, which reportedly turned out to be more immediately profitable than the fancy new tower Caesar's Palace had just built. Other casinos took notice, and by the 1980s, the budget and family formula Bennett pioneered had reshaped how a huge chunk of the Strip did business. By 1983, Bennett and Pennington had completed their full purchase of the company, and Circus Circus Enterprises went public. The turnaround was staggering. A casino that had nearly folded within a year of opening was now generating close to $1 billion a year in revenue and had become, at one point, Nevada's largest private employer, building an empire. Once Bennett had money to reinvest, he didn't slow down. Circus Circus opened a sister property in Reno in 1978, expanded into Laughlin with the Edgewater in 1983, added a 29-story tower to the Las Vegas flagship in 1986, and kept stacking wins, one after another. Pennington, meanwhile, largely stepped back from day-to-day operations and retired around 1988, leaving Bennett to run the empire he'd helped build. In 1990, the company opened the medieval-themed Excalibur next door for around $300 million, at the time the largest hotel in the world by room count. 3 years later came the Luxor, a $375 million black glass pyramid that, alongside Excalibur, turned that stretch of the South Strip into a family tourism corridor that Bennett had more or less invented the blueprint for a decade earlier at Circus Circus itself. Circus Circus itself didn't sit still while all this expansion happened elsewhere. In August 1993, the resort opened its own indoor amusement park, originally called Grand Slam Canyon. Built under a massive pink-tinted glass dome for somewhere around $75 to $90 million and elevated on a reinforced concrete deck above what used to be a parking lot. It opened with 4 major attractions, including a looping roller coaster called the Canyon Blaster, a log flume, and enough Southwest desert theming to make you forget you were standing above a casino parking lot an hour earlier. The dome itself was made of over 350,000 square feet of insulated glass, designed to let in natural light while keeping the desert heat firmly on the outside. The park was renamed the Adventure Dome later in the decade, and it's still there today, one of the last pieces of old-school, non-ironic Vegas theming left on the Strip. By 1996 and 1997, a 35-story tower had gone up as well, pushing the resort's room count into the thousands. In 1999, Circus Circus Enterprises opened Mandalay Bay and rebranded itself Mandalay Resort Group, a name meant to signal that this company had grown well past its circus tent origins into something closer to a full-blown Strip conglomerate, sitting on Mandalay Bay, Luxor, Excalibur, half of the Monte Carlo, and, of course, the original Circus Circus itself. But growth wasn't painless. Bennett had built an empire almost entirely inside Nevada, at a time when rivals were racing to expand into newly legalized gaming markets in other states, from riverboats in the Midwest to tribal casinos springing up across the country. Wall Street started punishing the stock for what looked like a lack of geographic diversification. In 1995, as share prices slid, despite the shiny new Excalibur and Luxor sitting right there generating cash, Bennett resigned as chairman after 2 decades running the company. He'd go on to buy the aging Sahara for a relative bargain and try the exact same trick all over again, remodeling it into another affordable, family-friendly destination. He died in December 2002 at age 78, having spent nearly 4 decades reshaping how Las Vegas thought about its everyday customer. The company he built kept his name off the marquee, though. It just kept going, one new tower and one new property at a time. Swallowed by a giant. By the mid-2000s, the Las Vegas Strip was consolidating into a handful of massive operators, and Mandalay Resort Group was one of the last big independent prizes left. MGM Mirage came calling in June 2004 with an initial offer worth roughly $7.65 billion, which climbed to $7.9 billion by the time the deal actually closed in April 2005. MGM Mirage chairman Terry Lanny called it a historic moment, not just for his company, but for the entire industry, and it's hard to argue with him. That total figure included around $4.8 billion in cash equity, $600 million in convertible debentures, and the assumption of roughly $2.5 billion in existing Mandalay debt. But however you sliced it, this was one of the largest hospitality mergers in American history, and it put nearly half of the Strip's hotel rooms and around 40% of its slot machines under a single company's control. Federal regulators cleared the deal without requiring MGM to sell off a single property, which tells you a lot about how consolidated the Strip was already becoming. Circus Circus came along as part of that package deal. It wasn't the crown jewel anymore. Mandalay Bay and Luxor were the properties getting the headlines. Circus Circus, the resort that had once single-handedly rewritten the economics of the Strip, was now just one line item among dozens inside a much bigger portfolio. MGM did have plans to renovate and modernize the aging property, folding it into a broader vision for the north end of the Strip that included fresh investment across several of its older assets. Then, 2008 happened. The financial crisis gutted Las Vegas tourism and construction spending across the entire city almost overnight, visitor numbers dropped, convention business dried up, and MGM, like nearly everyone else on the Strip, shelved its expansion plans practically company-wide, including a partially built city center tower that sat dormant for years. For Circus Circus, that pause turned into something closer to a permanent state. While neighboring resorts eventually got facelifts, new towers, and rebrands once the recovery finally arrived, Circus Circus largely stayed frozen in time, an aging monument to a version of Las Vegas that the rest of the Strip was quietly trying to leave behind in favor of nightclubs, celebrity chefs, and increasingly expensive resort fees. Frozen at the North End. For the better part of the next decade, Circus Circus kept doing what it had always done best, which was making money off people who didn't care about marble floors. $2 hot dogs, $2 beers, cheap rooms, a casino floor that never really pretended to be anything other than what it was. It remained, and still remains, the only property on the Strip with its own RV park and its own standalone motel. The place had already cemented itself as a piece of pop culture shorthand for a certain kind of chaotic, unglamorous Vegas experience, most famously as a memorable stop in Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, where the circus-themed casino floor becomes a kind of fever dream backdrop for the book's drug-addled narrator. That reputation, equal parts charming and unsettling, followed the property for decades, and honestly, it fit. But the physical property showed its age. Reviewers and longtime visitors started describing it less as nostalgic and more as tired. A place where the paint was peeling off the faux circus tent facade, and the carpet had seen one too many decades of foot traffic. It sat at the northern end of the Strip, a stretch that, for years, wasn't exactly a hotbed of investment. While City Center rose to the south in 2009, and the Cosmopolitan brought a new kind of energy mid-strip, that same year, the North End quietly became the part of Las Vegas people drove past on their way to somewhere else, anchored by an aging Sahara, a half-built Fontainebleau shell that sat dormant for the better part of 2 decades, and Circus Circus, still selling cheap rooms exactly the way it had in 1975. By 2019, MGM had shifted its whole corporate strategy toward what it called asset-light operations, essentially selling off real estate it owned outright and either leasing it back or, in Circus Circus's case, just selling it off entirely. That October, MGM agreed to sell Circus Circus to Phil Ruffin, the billionaire who already owned Treasure Island down the Strip and had a decades-long friendship with former MGM leadership. The deal, worth $825 million, included $662.5 million in cash and a $162.5 million note due in 2024, and it covered the roughly 3,700-room hotel and casino, the Adventure Dome, the 10-acre RV park, the neighboring Slots of Fun casino, and 37 acres of festival grounds, along with roughly 2,300 employees. Ruffin himself later admitted MGM had essentially been sitting on the property, telling one interviewer that he'd been trying to buy it for years before someone at MGM finally came around and said it was up for sale. For context, MGM had paid $7.9 billion for the entire Mandalay portfolio in 2005. 14 years later, one of that portfolio's 4 Las Vegas properties, and arguably the most historically important one, went out the door for well under $1 billion. Not because the business was failing. Circus Circus was still profitable. It just wasn't glamorous, and glamour is what gets a Strip property invested in. The land play. Here's where things get interesting, and a little cynical, depending on how you look at it. Ruffin didn't buy Circus Circus because he loved circus acts or budget buffets. He bought it because of the dirt underneath it. The property sits on 102 acres at the north end of the Strip, right near the Sahara, with highway access and roughly 2,000 feet of Strip frontage. And Ruffin has been pretty open about the fact that the casino operation itself was almost beside the point. He'd pulled off nearly the exact same move before. In 1998, he bought the old New Frontier for $165 million, made essentially no improvements to the property, and flipped it 9 years later for $1.2 billion. A return north of 700% that became something of a legend in Las Vegas real estate circles. Circus Circus, in his mind, was the same trick playing out on a much bigger stage, and he wasn't shy about saying so out loud. Ruffin's business style has always leaned toward buying underappreciated real estate and simply waiting. He picked up Treasure Island from MGM in 2009 for $775 million during the depths of the financial crisis, when almost nobody else wanted to be buying Las Vegas real estate at all. He's also held stakes in the Trump International Hotel just off the Strip. At 89 years old, still showing up to his office before 5 in the morning most days, Ruffin has built a reputation as one of the last old-school Vegas land barons still playing the long game. By January 2025, with the neighboring Fontainebleau finally open after decades of stalled construction and renewed interest in developing the North Strip, Ruffin started floating the idea of selling. He told Forbes the site was worth around $5 billion. "It's the best piece of land on the West Coast," he said, pointing to the highway access, the strip frontage, and the sheer size of the parcel. "You can almost build a city on it," he added. He also noted the casino itself was still pulling in roughly $90 million a year before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, and doing it with essentially no debt, which is a remarkable thing to be able to say about a 50-plus-year-old budget resort. Not everyone bought the $5 billion number, though. Industry observers and real estate watchers pushed back almost immediately, arguing that figure looked inflated given comparable land sales elsewhere on the Strip, with some estimates for the property, adjacent fairgrounds included, landing closer to $1.5 billion instead, a difference of well over $3 billion depending on whose math you trust. Ruffin, for his part, had gone from paying $825 million in 2019, worth roughly $1 billion in today's dollars once you adjust for inflation, to claiming a valuation nearly 5 times that just a handful of years later, and skeptics were quick to point out that talk is a lot cheaper than an actual closed transaction. As of this recording, no sale has gone through, and Circus Circus remains exactly where it's always been, on the north end of the Strip, selling cheap drinks to anyone willing to walk through the doors. That gap between $5 billion and $1.5 billion is really the whole story hiding underneath the circus tent. A resort that helped define an entire era of Las Vegas, that at its peak helped drive a company worth nearly $8 billion, is now mostly discussed in terms of what its parking lots and fairgrounds might be worth to some future developer, rather than what actually happens inside its doors every night. What's actually left? Walk onto the casino floor at Circus Circus today, and you can still catch a glimpse of what made it special in the first place. It bills itself as home to the largest permanent circus in the world, and free circus and trapeze acts still run daily above the Midway, a genuine rarity in a city that's largely replaced spectacle with nightclubs and celebrity residencies. The Adventure Dome still operates, still pulling in families who want air conditioning and a roller coaster without leaving the building, and has quietly grown over the decades from 4 rides to nearly 24. The RV park and the motel out back still exist, quiet holdouts from a completely different business model than the one the rest of the Strip runs on now. In some ways, that's the most surprising part of this whole story. For all the corporate churn, the ownership changes, and the frozen renovation plans, nobody has actually gotten rid of the circus. But the contrast with its neighbors has only gotten sharper. Fontainebleau opened next door in late 2023 after one of the most infamous stalled construction stories in Vegas history, bringing glass towers and a completely different price point to a stretch of the Strip that used to be Circus Circus's uncontested territory. The revived arena project between Fontainebleau and the Sahara has only added to the sense that the North Strip is finally getting the investment it went without for years. Investment that has, so far, mostly happened around Circus Circus rather than inside it. The casino has become something of a symbol in local coverage, a place people talk about less for what's happening on its gaming floor and more for what could theoretically be built there instead. It's a strange kind of legacy for the resort that basically invented the idea of Las Vegas as a family destination. A complicated legacy. Circus Circus has survived nearly 6 decades, 3 ownership eras, an admission fee that should never have existed, a mob-connected gift shop, a bribery indictment, a financial crisis that froze its renovation plans indefinitely, and a corporate sale that treated it as one asset among many rather than the founding piece of an empire. Through all of it, it never actually closed. It never went bankrupt. It just kept selling cheap beer and cheap rooms while the city built increasingly expensive things around it, decade after decade, ownership group after ownership group. Jay Sarno, who died of a heart attack in July 1984 at just 62 years old, collapsing in a suite at the very Caesars Palace he'd once built and later sold, never lived to see what his circus tent gamble eventually became. He'd sold his stake in Circus Circus in the early 1970s under financial pressure, reportedly walking away with somewhere north of $70 million, a fraction of what the company would later be worth once Bennett and Pennington got through with it. Sarno spent his final years chasing an even bigger dream, a 6,000-room mega-resort called the Grandissimo that never got built, largely because he simply ran out of money and momentum to pull it off. Ironically, that number, 6,000 rooms, would have sounded absurd to most casino operators in the 1970s, and now sounds almost modest for a modern strip resort. Sarno was right about where Las Vegas was headed, decades before anyone else could see it. He just wasn't the one who got to cash in on it. Whether Circus Circus eventually gets sold again, redeveloped into something unrecognizable, or simply keeps chugging along selling $2 hot dogs to families who don't care about marble floors, is anyone's guess at this point. Ruffin has said the money from any eventual sale would likely go toward buying yet another strip property, keeping the cycle of land speculation running exactly as it has for the last several decades. Analysts who track the Nevada gaming market have generally agreed on one thing, even when they disagree about the exact price tag. Everything on the strip is for sale at the right number, and Circus Circus, despite 50-plus years of history, is no exception. What's clear is that the gap between what the property represents historically and what it's actually valued at today says something about how Las Vegas measures success now. It's not really about the acts under the big top anymore, the trapeze artists, the free entertainment, the $2 beer that somehow still exists in a city where everything else costs a small fortune. It's about the acreage underneath it, and what somebody with enough money might eventually decide to build there instead. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the Strip's strangest survival stories, do us a favor and drop a like, and subscribe if you want more videos breaking down the rise and fall of Las Vegas's most iconic properties, the ones everybody drives past, but nobody really knows the full story behind. Let us know in the comments if you've ever actually stayed at Circus Circus, whether you think that reputation is deserved, and what you think should eventually happen to that 102 acres of land at the north end of the Strip. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.